Welcome to UJA's Words Matter, a series devoted to the idea that language doesn't just describe the world, it shapes it. Tonight, we're privileged to host a woman who has spent her career proving exactly that. Melanie Phillips is Exhibit A, that words matter. She's an award-winning British journalist, broadcaster, author, who uses her voice and her keyboard to fight for Western civilization. What distinguishes Melanie is not only her meticulous research, integrity, courage, she has all the above in abundance. It's her clarity. Well before October 7th, she warned us about the gathering storm of anti-Westernism, antisemitism, and yes, even about our incoming mayor. Her book, Londonistan, published in 2006, warned of Britain's capitulation to Islamism. In The World Turned Upside Down, published in 2010, Melanie described the West as a place where truth and lies, right and wrong, victim and aggressor are all turned upside down. She wrote that 15 years ago. Her newest book, The Builder's Stone, How Jews and Christians Built the West and Why Only They Can Save It, is truthfully a jarring wake-up call, but also a roadmap. It exposes the West's decline, yet insists renewal is possible if we have the courage to reclaim our foundational values. I didn't think I had much in common with Melanie. I have never published anything. But I discovered, before this event, that we are both doing Daf Yomi, studying a page of Talmud every day on the same schedule as Jews around the world to complete the entire Talmud in 7.5 years. While reading The Builder's Stone, I kept thinking of something we had studied in the Talmud in connection with Hanukkah, which fittingly begins this Sunday night. Unlike the Shabbat candles, which are to be lit indoors, the Hanukkah candles must be lit in a place so that the outside world can see them. This lesson came back to me as I read Melanie's book. A world that prizes universalism, but is on the brink of moral collapse, can learn a profound lesson from the light of the Jewish people, a millennia-old nation who light Hanukkah candles every year to celebrate and to transmit their utterly particular story. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear from a thinker who helps illuminate the world in much the same way. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Melanie Phillips. Hello? Okay. Melanie, what a privilege to welcome you to UJA. Before we dive into the book, I'd like to begin with your story. How did the daughter of Jewish immigrants who began her career at The Guardian, which for our American audience is left of the New York Times, become one of the most articulate conservative voices in Britain and one of Israel's fiercest defenders?
I didn't think there was anything could be left of the New York Times. Well, my parents were not actually immigrants. They were both born in Britain, but my paternal grandparents came from Poland, and my maternal great-grandparents came from Belarus. And I had a very, I was born in 1951. I had a kind of upbringing which was very typical of British Jews of the time. My family, I'm an only child. My parents belonged to a conventional Orthodox shul, but they were 3 times a year shul goers. We were not Shomer Shabbat, we were not Shomer really anything, but we were kosher, both at home and not at home. Anyway, I grew up in a background in which it would have been unthinkable to have voted anything other than for the Labour Party, because that's where the family came from. It was, you know, like so many Jews of that kind, that, you know, we were steeped in the idea that, you know, we were the little people, and we voted with the little people. And even when we collectively became more prosperous, we were still voting with the little people. Except that unlike here, in fact, that did change over time, and British Jews became, until fairly recently, I think I'm right in saying that they were majority Conservative Party voters at general elections. That's all now gone by the board. We might talk about that because the Conservative Party has basically all but collapsed. That's another story. So I grew up and I became a journalist almost by accident, another story, and I ended up on The Guardian, and I thought I was in absolute heaven because it was people like me. We all believed in the same things. We all believed that we were... I didn't consider myself to be left-wing. At that time, we all called ourselves liberal left or left liberals. And I thought it was the same thing. If you were liberal, by which I mean traditionally liberal, in the sense that you believed in tolerance and live and let live and committed to the progress of the human race and betterment of society. And I thought that was the same as people who were left-wing. So we were liberal left, and we were all basically marching under the same banner until I realized that we weren't. And that was very early on, in fact. I think I joined The Guardian in something like 77, something like that. And I kind of rose through the ranks rather fast. I was a kind of, you know, a sort of, you know, up-and-coming young person. And then I became an editorial writer. And again, I was in absolute seventh heaven. There were people like me. They were just so nice. They were so intelligent. They were so thoughtful. They all were so liberal. They believed in the right things. And until 1982, when Israel was fighting a rather desperate war in Lebanon, and I'd never been to Israel, never wanted to go to Israel. Another story. And I didn't have much interest in what was going on in Israel. I was a domestic social policy writer. But I was aware that Israel had gone into Lebanon, maybe ill-advisedly in the way that it was conducting the war, but it had gone in a defensive mode, as indeed all Israel's wars are defensive, because at that time the Palestine Liberation Organization had set up shop in Lebanon. It was wreaking havoc in Israel from Lebanon. Israel tried to get rid of it. Long story, but that's what it was doing. But it was represented in Britain, and particularly at The Guardian, as an act of aggression. Israel basically had gone into Lebanon and was pulverizing the poor Palestinians. And I was perplexed by this. I didn't really understand why The Guardian was taking this view. I was also very concerned that out of the woodwork, because Israel was behaving in this way in the Lebanon and people didn't like it, out of the woodwork came old-fashioned anti-Semitism. This idea, you know, we were being told to our face, you people all stick together, as if like, I mean, I've never been to Israel. I mean, what are you talking about? And then I noticed that there was one particular set of stories, you may not recall, you may recall, Assad the father caused the deaths of between 10 and 40,000 of his probably Muslim Brotherhood opponents over the course of a short period of time, like a couple of weeks. And it was a story, it was on the foreign pages, it was a decent story, but it was, you know, no big shakes. Nobody wrote about it, nobody noticed it, nobody said anything bad about what happened. But every day, the Israelis would kill like 3 Palestinians in Lebanon, and it'd be a front page story, there'd be furious op-eds, enraged editorials. And so, in all innocence, because I was a very different person then, I said to my editorial room colleagues, why do we appear to have a double standard? And there was a silence, and everybody looked at me. And I realized I crossed a line. And I didn't know what line I'd crossed and why. And I couldn't understand why everybody was going like, what did she say? Like the Bateman cartoon. And they said, well, of course we have a double standard. Because, I mean, you are like us. I suddenly become you. I thought I was we. But I become you, and there was us. You are like us. We all believe, we're all brought up to believe in human rights, sanctity of human life, respect for every person. That's how we're all brought up. But in the developing world, and Syria was part of the developing world, in the developing world they're not brought up to think like that. They're not brought up with those values. They don't have respect for human life. So we can't judge them by our standards. We judge you by our standards because you tell us you're more moral than us. But we can't judge them by our standards. That would be racism. And I said, what? You mean, if one is unfortunate enough to be born into the developing world, one does not therefore have the same rights to life and liberty as we do? To me, that's racism. And from there, it all went downhill rather fast. My card was marked. I was no longer considered British by my editorial room colleagues. It was quite clear. My country was Israel. I'd never been to Israel. I never wanted to go to Israel. And then it was a kind of watershed moment, but I was a very different person then, and I didn't put everything together at all. But what it did mean was that I realized in that instant that people that I kind of set my moral clock by, I couldn't. That they were on the other side to me. That I thought we were all marching under the same banner, but actually they were on the other side. They were seriously racist. They really did think that people who had brown skins had less right to life and liberty than they did. And they really did think that Jews were something very wrong with Jews. And I realized that far from being, you know, the upholders of everything that was right and decent and good, they were on the other side to me. And so I stopped paying attention, as it were, to the kind of moral lessons that they were teaching. And so this freed me in my mind to look at things as they were, rather than through the prism of what they thought. And consequently, I descended into the pit of infamy. Having been a guardianista, I became, you know, the she-devil of the Western Hemisphere. Issue after issue, the collapse of education, the collapse of the traditional family, the willed collapse of the traditional family, the denial of the Western nation, the rewriting of the kind of national story to being that the West and Britain were born in the original sins of colonialism and imperialism and so on. I wrote about all these things, and with every issue that I wrote, I lost all my friends, and I lost my status at The Guardian. I became it was like a kind of internal harem I was in. There was no longer even banter at the tea trolley. I was no longer invited to bijou dinner parties in fashionable parts of London. And it took me a very long time to realize that all these things were connected. These issues I was writing about were connected. And it took me an even longer time to realize that not only were those things connected to do with kind of, well, I would say the collapse of the West, but the collapse of the West was intimately connected to the attitudes to Israel and the Jews. And it was a long, it's called a, you know, you've been on a journey. I mean, so many of us have been on a journey of one kind or another. But nevertheless, it was a process that took me a very, very long time. And consequently, you know, I became something which was considered to be sort of unconscionable among the people that I used to consider to be my friends and colleagues.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for sharing. I want to now talk about the book. It's an extraordinary book, challenging. You begin with a powerful line. The West is poised at a momentous and fateful juncture. An onslaught is being mounted against Western society by its enemies within and without. Let's start at the beginning. When you talk about the West and Western civilization, what do you mean and what's at stake?
Yes, well, the question of what is the West is a rather difficult question. It's not simply a matter of geography, because there's parts of the West which are actually the East. Parts of Europe, the Eastern Europe. Do we consider that to be the West? Well, no, we don't. So the West is a kind of idea. It's certainly the English-speaking world, but it's also France. I mean, even given the way President Macron behaves, I think it is still part of the West. I would like it not to be. I'd like it to be sort of towed away and sunk. But anyway, the West is an idea. What we mean by the West is an idea of modernity. It's the countries that that emerged from the European Enlightenment and created what we now consider to be the modern world. The division of church and state, the freeing up, therefore, of a society which enabled tolerance, the development of representative democracy, and so on. All those things, and the values that came out of that, reverence for reason, but also what we call civilized values, which is to do with how you build a community of built on a shared sense of purpose, based on the Western nation state, which encompassed the ability to translate that into practice. These things all developed at different times, but it's that sort of constellation of ideas that I mean by the West. And so I sort of use the West simultaneously with Western civilization and civilization, because I think the West produced civilization. And that, the reason I wrote the book was that it seemed to me, and I've written this in the book, that one cannot understand the lunatic onslaught on Israel and the Jewish world from the West as a direct result of October 7 and the war that followed, where you would have expected a civilized society to join with the people who were being attacked by the forces of barbarism. You can't understand that reaction, which was so perverse, because faced with the choice between civilization and barbarism, the West has not chosen civilization. You can't understand that reaction unless you understand the attack that the West has made on itself and its own core values over many, many decades. And you can't understand the attack that the West has made on itself over many decades unless you understand the centrality to the West of Judaism and the Jewish people, both for good and bad.
Perfect. That's my next question. A central thesis of your book, and I'm biased, so it's one that I loved, is that Jewish values rooted in the Torah are not merely part of the West, they're its foundation. And you write beautifully, Judaism is the West's civilizational soul. I didn't actually always think of it that way. So what are some core Jewish ideas that formed Western society, and what happens when those are forgotten?
Yes, well, people obviously think that the underpinnings, the moral underpinnings of the West came from Christianity, and it's demonstrably true that Christianity is the foundational religion of the West. But Christianity didn't come from nowhere, and its central ethical principles that the West adopted are Jewish principles. They came from the Hebrew Bible. What do I mean? What sort of principles am I talking about? And they're absolutely fundamental principles, principles we've just been talking about, such as respect for every human life, because every human being is made in the image of God. The tremendous priority given to justice and compassion. Okay, the Christians kind of turned it round, so it's compassion and justice, but nevertheless, justice and compassion was ours. This idea that, in the West, the kind of values that we take for granted, that everybody takes for granted, which are to do with justice and compassion and orderliness and taking responsibility for your actions. The idea has grown up that these are kind of universal, that they're kind of imprinted in us, in our DNA, or they were given to us by the Greeks. Well, none of that is remotely true. They came from us. So those are the kind of the obvious things, that when people think about religion and its impact on the development of the West, they're thinking about the moral infrastructure. But there is something else which I think very few people understand or know about, which is the tremendous importance of Judaism and the Hebrew Bible on the development of what became in Britain the constitutional monarchy, and in America became the foundations of the Constitution. And this was the principles in the Davidic kingdom, the Davidic monarchy, which were explicitly drawn upon by the people who framed what became the British constitutional settlement, those 18th century thinkers who were evangelical Christians and were scripturally faithful, and they read their Hebrew Bible and they understood that there were priceless things in it for the development of political freedom. Those priceless things included what were, in the time of the ancient Israelites, absolutely revolutionary principles for basically very primitive societies, which were, for example, the idea that law, by which people had to live, was not something that would be laid down by a ruler upon the people and they would all have to do what he said. Law was rooted in the consent of the people, and that goes back to when Moses came down the mountain and said, "Here is the law, people, what do you think?" And the people said, "Yep, we'll have that. We agree. We hear and we will do. We will do and we will hear." That's revolutionary. And that was the basis, law rooted in the consent of the people is the basis of representative democracy. That was one thing. The other thing was that the ruler was constrained by other things. So in ancient Israel, the king was constrained by God above, because the king was not the ultimate ruler. Unlike other primitive societies, the king was not the ultimate ruler. It was God above that was the ultimate ruler. And around the king were other fetters on his authority, such as judges and priests and prophets. Now, there were kings who were terrible, and they did terrible things, as we know. But nevertheless, that template was revolutionary. And the third thing was that the Davidic monarchy brought together tribes that otherwise might have been basically at each other's throats and unified them into one people, one kingdom, a united kingdom. And those three things were terribly important and were drawn upon by the framers of the British constitutional settlement. The same people went to America, founded America, and founded America's constitutional settlement, and again drew explicitly upon it. And in America there are all kinds of artifacts and writings which reflect that. So these things, so in other words, Judaism and Jewish people and Jewish peoplehood and Jewish traditions were absolutely central to the development of the West. And it seemed to me to be no surprise that when the West turned on itself, because it said the West is fundamentally evil and it's got the sins of colonialism and racism and whiteness and all the rest of it, it turned on its core values, because the core values had to go, they had to be replaced by something else. Those core values were basically Jewish values. So it's no surprise that that same West turned upon the Jewish people and the collective Jewish people in the state of Israel.
Yes, I hope they're teaching that in British schools, where the template for the monarchy came from.
I think they're not.
I think they're not. They should.
But are they teaching it in Jewish schools?
Well,
no, they are not.
They're starting to. Okay, talking about Jews in Israel. You write about, and we've seen, the progressive left's obsession with Jews and Israel. You've started talking about it. Why is this fixation so intense? What do Israel and Jews represent?
Oh, if you were somebody from another planet and you arrived in Britain or America, and you would say to yourself, "My goodness, these Jews, there must be tens of millions of them." They obviously run everything, because everybody talks about them the whole time without remission. So there is something seriously weird about this. I asked somebody who wrote a book about, he's a historian, and he's written a lot about the importance of Christianity in Britain and how it's disregarded. And I ran into him a few months after October 7th, and I said to him, and he's somebody who's not sympathetic to Jews, or he hadn't been. He had not been. And he looked at me rather warily, and I looked at him extremely warily. And I said to him, "Why do you think this is all happening?" And he said, "Because we all know that at the root of everything that we all stand for are the Jews, and we are turning on them." And this was somebody who was not sympathetic. So what is the meaning of this obsession? Well, there are many ways you could explain. There are many things you can do to explain this. First of all, the left of politics has been, in the West generally, has been generally kind of taken over by what used to be called the extreme left, which is basically, it's Marxist doctrine. People don't think of themselves as Marxists. They don't want to seize the levers of economic power. But they've imbued one of the core principles of Marxism, which is that every single relationship in the world is governed by power. You are either powerful or powerless. Now, it's not true, but that's the way it's framed. So everything is framed in that way. So you're either a victim or a victimizer. You cannot, if you're a victim, you can do nothing bad because you're not responsible for your actions because you're a victim. If you're a victimizer, you can do nothing good because you are a victimizer. So the West, the capitalist West, is the victimizer. The developing world is the victim. The developing world, therefore, cannot do anything bad. If it goes around killing millions of people, it's not its fault, just as I was told in The Guardian. They can't help it. It's not their fault because they are the victims of the first world, the developed world, the capitalist world, which therefore cannot ever be a victim. Under this rubric, Israel is the first world. Israel is the powerful people. It's not, the powerful people because it's an adjunct of America. This is how people think. It's an adjunct of America because it has nuclear weapons and because it's white. Well, actually, it's not white. It's brown and black because the majority of people there are brown and black-skinned, which the left-winger says, oh, but they're really white. Even if they're black, they're white because they have power. And if you have power, you're white, even if you're black. That is the conversation one has to have these days. Fine. So there's all of that, which is, a lunacy that's come out of left-wing ideology. There's that. Now, at the root of all that, one of the reasons why the Jews can't be powerless is because, quite apart from America and Israel and all that, everybody knows that the Jews run everything. They run Hollywood, they run the media, they run the law, they run finance. And so they run capitalism. And consequently, at the very heart of the what's called intersectionality, this doctrine of overlapping minority victim groups, which excludes the Jews. It excludes them because they can't be victims because they run everything. So at the very heart of left-wing political thinking, which people kind of imbibe without thinking it through, but that's the kind of assumptions they have, is the idea that the Jews are on the other side and they're people who can't really do anything right, and they certainly can't ever be victims. So along comes October 7, and what does one see if one is a left-wing person who subscribes to all this? You have adopted the Palestinian cause as proof of your conscience, your moral wonderfulness, because you're supporting people who are the oppressed of the world, and they are oppressed by these people called Jews who have nuclear power, who have America behind them, who are all white even though they're black, and so on and so forth. And you've basically, that's your moral badge of worth. And on October 7, what do you see? You see that the people you have supported have not just killed, but have behaved like sadistic, barbarian savages and have done things which you can't even begin to get your mind round. Now, you cannot believe that they've done this. And they've done this to the people that you've told yourself over many decades are the oppressors of those people who've done this. So it can't be. It cannot be. Because if you accept that as a left-wing person, and if you think that any challenge to your left-wing ideologies must mean that the person who's challenging you is a bad person because you stand for everything that's good and wonderful and true and right and just in the world, so any challenge to you is coming from people who are not just wrong, they're quite evil because they stand against the betterment of humanity, which you stand for. So if you actually believe that the people you've supported have turned into barbarians and the people you have said are oppressors are really victims of the most appalling things, then what does it make you? It makes you an evil right-winger. You can't have that. So you find every means possible to deny it. You say, it didn't happen. If you're a feminist, you say, it wasn't rape. There's no evidence of rape. These are people who have basically condemned the entire male sex as rapists. They all have to prove their innocence of being rapists. And suddenly, there's no evidence of rape. You have people who said, there is no evidence of any of these atrocities happening, but if they did happen, well, it's Israel's fault because this is just resistance, and so on. And then you have people who, and we all saw this on social media, the amazing, to me, pictures, video coverage of the people on the streets of Britain, and I think America and elsewhere, with their fingernails tearing down the pictures of the hostages. Now, these weren't pictures, these weren't posters advertising, you know, make a new career in the IDF. They weren't posters saying, come and have a holiday in Eilat. They were pictures of women and children and babies and men who had been taken hostage, who had been kidnapped and were undoubtedly being tortured and murdered. And they couldn't bear it. Why couldn't they bear it? Why did they have to tear it down? You saw their faces were convulsed in rage and hatred as they did it. What was going on there? They had to tear out of their minds the very idea that the Israelis could ever be victims. It was intolerable to them because it meant that they would have to rethink how they thought about themselves as moral beings. And they wanted to tear out this idea of the Israeli as victim, but I think they also wanted to tear out the idea of the Jew as part of their world. They wanted the Jews gone because it gets in the way. If you are the new sort of left-winger who believes in universal values, you believe that to be particular, to be attached to the particulars of a culture or a nation, and there is no more particular set of people than Jews in terms of what we're attached to, if you believe that it's only through universal values that you can achieve the betterment of humanity, and that the attachment to the particular is the province of people who are really evil people, then the Jews are going to be absolutely in your way. You have got to get rid of them from your world because they stand in the way of the betterment of humanity through universalist ideas. It's all those things which are going on. And then, you know, don't get me started, but there is another dimension which is not simply connected to people on the left at all, but it's to do with the overwhelming collective guilt that I believe the West feels for the Holocaust, and I think, insofar as they know about this at all, for the treatment of Jews going back centuries. They kind of know that the culture that they're part of did this. And they can't bear it. And because they can't bear it, and because it's such a terrible burden to them, they have to turn Jews into Nazis, because then they're free. Then they're free. Then if Jews can be Nazis, well, I mean, you know, we don't have to worry about them anymore. Somebody once said this to me. It was a left-wing journalist who I had previously held in high esteem because he was a man of the left, but he was very open-minded in a variety of issues. And long before October 7, I think probably during the years around the Second Intifada, I was, I'd started writing and speaking about anti-Semitism. And he said to me one day, he said, you've got this completely wrong when you're talking about anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitism that we're seeing. So I said, well, what is it? Expecting him to say, well, it's not anti-Semitism, it's just Israel, because that's what everybody says. But he didn't say that. He said something much worse and very revealing. He said, it's not anti-Semitism. I said, what is it? He said, what you have to understand is that it's such a relief not to have to worry about the Jews anymore. And I said, I was a bit confused by this. What do you mean? Why should he be worried about the Jews? Was he concerned for our welfare? And he said, well, you have to understand that, after discovery of the extermination camps, we couldn't say anything bad about the Jews at all, because we were accused of anti-Semitism. And now, it's like that burden's been lifted. I said, what are you telling me? What are you telling me? That now you can say the Israelis are Nazis, all bets are off, that you can now go back to being anti-Semitic? He said, I didn't say that. I said, that's exactly what you said. You see, he didn't think he said that, but he did. He didn't understand what he'd said, but he did. We don't have to worry about the Jews anymore. We can go back to what we know is correct, which is that the Jews are really disgusting and foul and run everything, and they are all looking after themselves and putting us at risk and all that. We can now say it again. That's what's going on as well. All these things. It's not a simple matter.
That certainly explains why genocide is the word of choice.
Absolutely.
Okay, now we're going to go to the other side. This wasn't addressed in your book because it's a little newer in the United States, but since your book came out in last January, we're seeing virulent anti-Semitism on the right. You have Tucker Carlson reviving ancient conspiracy theories, platforming figures like Nick Fuentes, and the Heritage Foundation is defending them. How do you understand that?
Yes. I've been scratching my head from a distance of several thousand miles, trying to make sense of it all. There are various things to say, which, and you must forgive me because I'm coming at it from really as an outsider, and you all know much more about this than I do. But it seems to me that, first of all, this whole idea of a conspiracy theory is associated with what's called isolationism. And in America, there's been a significant a trend towards isolationism going back a very long time. So there was always that. And the question is why this is all kind of erupted in the way that it has and become so terribly extreme and so terribly open. There are various reasons for that, obviously. First of all, there is a whole generation of mainly young men who are very, very angry and very resentful, as I'm being told the whole time. They're angry and resentful because they feel that they have been dealt a really bad set of cards. They feel that they don't have good jobs. They feel they will never be able to earn enough money to buy a house. They feel that they are being trashed as men by the whole liberal culture. And they feel that, and this is very visceral, that their friends and associates and family members lost their lives and their limbs in wars in the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan, and have just been trashed. And what did America get for that? It was, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were, according to this way of thinking, a complete disaster. And we've all been left high and dry as a result. So there's that tremendous resentment among that kind of person. That's one reason for it. But another thing that strikes me, there are two things that strike me. First of all, the anti-Semitism, which is so open, I mean, it's quite extraordinary, and it's so deranged. You know, Jews are dragging Americans into wars in which America has no stake. Now, this didn't come out of Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes in the recent years, in recent times. I remember, and I continue to be astounded by, the reaction to the book produced by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt called The Israel Lobby. I remember when that came out, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, here you have somebody who is one of them was at Chicago University and the other was at Harvard.
Harvard Kennedy School.
Right, you have two very, very esteemed scholars who produced this book, which is Jewish conspiracy theory. It's basically Jews are taking us to hell in a handcart, laundered through Israel has taken us to war because of the Israel lobby, which is the Jewish lobby. So it was clearly coded anti-Semitism. And at the time, I thought, well, I mean, how is academia going to react to that? And I was astounded. Academia applauded. It applauded. Everybody went, really fascinating. Oh, yes, we must go and listen to them. And they drew in, you know, all these amazing crowds. Now, to this day, no one talks about them. People talking about Nick Fuentes, about Tucker Carlson, obviously, for obvious good reasons, but no one talks about them. They weren't MAGA people. They were pucker establishment Republicans. And nobody has said, we had that terrible thing, and we've just gone along with it. Why? So that's the second thing. The third thing is that when you get this rabid stuff coming out of the Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, all those sorts of people, how come it's being allowed to be said? How come it's not being run out of the room by people in disgust, which is how a healthy society would be doing that? It would be making these people into complete pariahs. Why isn't that happening? To me, the answer is obvious. Because the other side, who these people are spending their lives opposing, i.e. the liberal universalists, all those people who are taking America to hell in a handcart, according to the people on the MAGA right, those people on the left made what was previously forbidden language about Jews and Israel permissible. I mean, you got, you know, people on the left screaming now, you know, genocide, but before that, you had people on the left basically accusing Israel of doing terribly, you know, of doing evil things, and accusing Jews of supporting these terrible, evil people. You had an explosion over quite a long period of time of anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish power, covert Jewish power, being used to advance the interests of Israel and the Jewish people at the expense of everybody else. You had that on the left, and that kind of gave permission to people who had these views on the right, who were always there. Suddenly, you know, they could actually say exactly what they were thinking, which is terrible. So it's a kind of as one set giving permission to the other set, which partly explains what's happening. So, long story short, I think it's beyond troubling. What's beyond troubling is not that these lunatics exist. It's the fact that they're not being dealt with. This business of heritage, I think, was of the greatest possible importance and concern. Bad enough you've got these people in these circles saying these things, but it should be beyond any kind of doubt that they should be dealt with in the most condign manner possible and disapproved of and made into social pariahs. And instead you have what? Heritage? You know, the most establishment, conservative, influential think tank in America, not sure about how to behave to this, and indeed not just not sure, but saying it's freedom of speech. Do they not really understand the first thing about the difference between freedom of speech and incitement to racial hatred? I mean, what's happened to heritage is what's happened to the conservative movement. It's lost the moral plot. Now, if the conservative movement fragments in this way, if it doesn't get its act together and work out which side of the moral, where its moral compass should be set, if it goes down this kind of rabbit hole into these totally obnoxious ideologies, then it's over. It's over. Because why would anyone want to vote for them? Because, you know, the idea that, you know, you vote for that lot because in order to keep the other lot out, because the other lot are worse. In all my life, I've never voted, I think, positively for anybody. I've always voted because the other lot are so much worse. So it's like, and it's much the same in, you know, with Democrats and Republicans. You know, you vote to keep the other lot out. Well, if your lot are so terrible, then where do you cast your vote? And so you have this kind of paralysis, and we've got this in Britain as well. If the other lot are so terrible, if they're all so terrible, what happens? And the answer is, in Britain, what's happening is that people are divorcing themselves from the entire democratic process. They are saying, we have had it with representative democracy. We've got the Conservatives who are complete rubbish, and we cannot ever trust them to run the country again. We've got the Labour Party, which is running the country into the ground, and they're absolutely dreadful. We've got all these, you know, these two main parties, which stand for the alternatives that we all know. They're both terrible. Parliament's over. We can't trust anybody anymore. Who can we go to? Oh, look, here are street protests with people with, you know, green hair and rings through their noses, and they're saying things which I find really quite nice. And so, you know, you've got the democratic process now breaking down in Britain because people have lost faith in the entire political system. So, you know, America is behind Britain in many respects in these social, these alarming social trends. But I can see the same thing beginning to happen here. If you've got no decent alternative, what do you do? And that is where you have really bad people coming forward. That is the risk.
I see it. Okay, let's talk a little about New York. As we say in New York, let's talk Tachlis. A few weeks ago, as you saw in the video, a mob gathered outside Park East Synagogue, which is actually like 5 blocks from here. It's part of this ongoing wave of Israel demonization, Jew baiting. Zoran Mandani, our mayor-elect, refused to condemn the protest. This room is filled with Jewish leaders. You've watched similar trends unfold in Britain. What's your advice?
Well, first of all, people may not realize it, but the Jews aren't in this alone. Islamic lunatics threaten everybody. And the Jews are in the crosshairs, they're in the sharp end of all this for obvious reasons, but I can really only talk about Britain. In Britain, there are, you know, millions of people who have reached the end of their rope about Islamization. They've had it up to here with being told that they are racist and Islamophobic if they object to the intimidation of Britain and their local communities by aggressive Muslims. Now, in Britain, as I'm sure it's the case here, there are many, many Muslims who are fine. They have come to Britain, or they've been brought up in Britain in a way which means that they have completely adhere to core Western values. They are not a problem. Whether they actually like Jews or not, and whether that's a problem, is a separate issue. But in terms of the community at large, they're not a problem. But there are so many in the Muslim community in Britain who are a very, very serious problem, either because they present a terrorist threat, and the security service in Britain says that 90% of the people who are the most active threats to the country and who are on their watch list, 90% are Muslim. Muslims are something like 6% according to official figures of the population. Okay, you can say that's an underestimate, so let's double it. Let's say 12%. 90% are on the security service watch list. It's completely out of control. And then you have a very, very significant proportion, a minority, but a very significant proportion, 30%, 40%, whatever, of Muslims who want to live under Sharia law, who think that Islam, that Britain should become more Islamic, that they shouldn't become more British, Britain should become more Islamic. So this is a problem which the ordinary people are in revolt against, and they are, it's like a tinderbox. It's an increasingly inflammable tinderbox to which the cultural elite is not just ignoring it, but is basically going in the opposite direction. It's trying to shut down criticism of it, trying to beef up rules and laws against Islamophobia, which silence all dissent. So, what to do? What to do if you're a Jew? If you're a Jew in New York faced with this, you have to first of all make sure that the community is physically protected. It's the most important thing. You have to, I don't know what sort of security you have, but my goodness, you've got to really beef it up. You've got to really beef it up. You've got to really think that I'm afraid you've got to really think every single communal meeting, every single shul service is a potential Parki synagogue. You've got to think that. Otherwise, you're being indolent. You're not thinking properly. So that's the first thing. Security is terribly, terribly important. And then you've got to watch what's going to happen. You've got to understand what's going to happen here. My guess is that what Mamdani is going to do, and we saw this with Jeremy Corbyn, the far-left leader of the Labour Party who got chucked out, but he's still there. I'm happy to say he's going to be the alternative to when democracy goes down the chute. He and his new friends in the Greens are going to get together and complete the ruination of Britain. Fine. So he was doing the same thing which Mamdani is about to do. He's going to use Israel as the wedge issue to divide the Jews of New York. He's going to say, I'm not anti-Semitic. I love Jews. Look, I've got the Satmar with me. Thank you, Satmar. Okay, but beyond the Satmar, I've got all these young Jews who are wonderful people. They're wonderful. They are so moral. They are so lovely. They are so welcoming. They're so tolerant. And I'm surrounding myself with these people, and they all hate Israel. And they're all saying, and I'm getting this now from Jews in Britain, we have to redefine Judaism as being against Zionism. So the good Jews are going to be the anti-Zionist Jews. And he's going to surround himself with these Jews. And it's going to do all your heads in. And all the people, all the Jews who support Israel are going to be left out in the cold. And this is going to mess with people's heads something rotten. And I'm constantly hearing when, there are some of us who are very, very concerned and have been very, very concerned. A lot of us have been very concerned for a long time about the way so many young people are going in the Jewish community, the way in which they're turning against Israel, the way in which they know so little about Judaism. They're turning against the Jewish people, basically. And it's not just young people, it's community leaders as well, who, have taken this path of being anti-Zionist and so on. Now, what I've heard endlessly is, what we must guard against is disunity. It is disunity that has destroyed the Jewish people in the past. It is because we're not united, because we are fighting each other. That's why our enemies pick us off. No, actually, let's have a thought experiment. Okay, disunity is really bad. It's true. It is really bad. It does weaken you, no question. But let's have a thought experiment. Let's assume that 99% of Jews in the diaspora believed that, Zionism is really rotten, Israel is really rotten, and we're going to have a new Judaism which is going to be completely out with Zionism and out with Israel, and we're just going to redefine Judaism around John Lennon's Imagine. Brotherhood of man, imagine there's no religion, imagine that there's no nation, nothing to fight and die for. Yes, that's the new Jew. Right, let's suppose, thought experiment, 99% of Jews said, yes, we're all John Lennon Jews. That would be unity. And it would destroy us. We would no longer be Jews. How clever is that? In other words, disunity is really bad. It is really bad. It should be discouraged. We shouldn't fight each other. Let's take that as read. But there's something worse than disunity. It's if so many of us go down a path which turns against the Jewish people, because that is our destruction. Now, we have I think, as a community, I'm not talking about New York or America, I'm talking about Jews in the diaspora generally, we have a duty to try and stop that. We have a duty to call out in terms the people who are turning against Judaism and Jews and Israel. We have a duty to call them out and to say they are wrong, they are dangerous, they are not upholding Judaism, that what they say about upholding Judaism is a lie, is a lie. We should also call out the wretched Satmar and say, they should all be, basically, they'll Chilul Hashem and they'll be put into Cherem or whatever. I mean, we should not hold back, because we have to fight for Judaism, for the Jewish people and for Israel. Otherwise, we really are sunk, because we're going to be split. This is the strategy. This is the strategy. They're not going to come at us with, thuggish stuff and say, it's all out against all the Jews. No. They're going to pretend that they are with us, and they're going to basically blame us for the victimization that we are going to endure because we are supporting Israel. We have to stop that by not hiding from it, not trying to sort of smooth it over, but by saying, we see you, we understand what you're doing, and we are standing up for Israel, for Zionism, and this is why. And if you oppose Israel, if you oppose Zionism, you are opposing Judaism. You're taking the soul out of us, because Judaism is the inseparable fusion of the people, the religion, and the land. It doesn't mean that you have to be a Zionist to be a Jew. It doesn't mean you have to go and live in Israel to be a Jew. It doesn't mean you have to be Orthodox to be a Jew. But it does mean that if you try to separate out those three components, the people following their faith in the land, then you destroy Judaism. And we have to call it out as a community. That's what you are doing. Don't give us this rubbish that you are simply against Israel. You're against Judaism for this reason. And this is how the Jews, I think, have to be, we have now to double down. The likelihood, I'm afraid, is that people will be frightened and will retreat, and will try to find ways of trying to build bridges. Don't build bridges with this man. Burn them down.
Thank you. Glad I asked the question. I know we're nearing the end of our time, but we must end on a positive note.
You mean that
In the
wasn't
book,
positive?
well, you're a ray of sunshine. The book lists everything that ails the West very comprehensively. But in a compelling twist, you explain why Israel, Jews, and Christians, but in this room you can focus on Israel and the Jews, are part of the solution that can save it. Just walk us through how you understand Israel's remarkable strength and resilience, and what the West can learn from Israel and from the Jews to ensure its own survival.
Well, I think Israel's, what's happened in Israel since October 7 is such an important lesson for the West, because Israel, this war isn't over, And there are still very difficult times ahead, I'm afraid, and very difficult decisions to make. But Israel's going to win this, and it's going to come out stronger. Why? Why is it going to win this? So when you look at all the forces that were arrayed against it, and still are arrayed against it, but it's like, how can it possibly be that people are going to win this? And the answer is because Israel believes in itself. It will win it because it wants to. It will win it because it wants to live. Why does it want to live? Because it believes that what it stands for is, first of all, good and right and just and true, that all the things that Israel stands for and all the things the Jewish people stand for are great things, and they want those things to continue. And they feel that they are absolutely, in their very strong identity, they are absolutely connected to the past. And what Israel is telling us in the prosecution of this war is that if a people is to survive, then the present day people has to be connected to the past in order to have a future. If you tear up your past, you will not have a future because you no longer believe in yourself. I've been incredibly moved by all kinds of things during this war. And the thing that has moved me most, and maybe that's so for many of you as well, is that what the young conscript soldiers have said, so many of them, and they've said it in terms. They didn't just go to war to save their country from extermination, which clearly they were. I mean, the enemies were absolutely clear. They were going to destroy Israel. But it wasn't just that. These young people went to war in order to fulfill a sacred duty to all the Jews who had come before them. And they said this: all those generations who had lived and died in many respects, in many cases, in order to keep Judaism and the Jewish people alive, that they had gone to such lengths to make sure that despite everything, despite all the persecutions, despite all the slaughter, despite the genocide and the assimilation, that they had been intent upon keeping the Jewish people alive, and they'd gone to all that effort, and there'd been so much death and destruction and persecution in that history, and here they were today doing the same thing. And they described how they felt literally on the battlefield. They felt the shades of their ancestors behind them. There was one officer who I heard on the radio saying that on October 7, he did insanely courageous things. He had one small arm, and he went out and took on the Hamas terrorists who were still marauding around southern Israel. And he said, speaking much later, he said, people said, "Weren't you frightened?" And he said, "I heard my grandmother, who died in Auschwitz, I heard her say, 'Go, go.'" He heard it. And so there was that. And then all these young soldiers who, it's extraordinary. Israel has a new industry, making tzitzit. All these soldiers who sent out orders, we have to have tzitzit. What was going on here? These were boys who were not religious. They didn't wear tzitzit normally. They didn't pray. They all wanted to wear tzitzit. Why? Because it was what they were. They wore what they were. They wore their identity close to their hearts, underneath their battle armor. I thought that was incredibly moving. So things like that, and it was quite clear that if a country is going to survive, it has to want to live. Why does it want to live? Because it has a sense of its own identity that it loves and respects and wants to continue. How does it have that sense of identity? It has to be connected to its past. Now, you look at the West, it's torn up its past. It's told itself that its past is disgusting. It's told itself its identity is disgusting. And so that is the lesson that Israel has to teach the West, that if you want your culture to survive, you have to choose life. And that is the ultimate lesson that the Jews of the world and Israel are telling the West. Unfortunately, the West currently is not listening. But we have to keep saying it because it is the right thing to say, it's the right thing to do, it's the only thing to do. It is the difference between self-destruction and survival. And we have to tell it to ourselves. We have to understand and internalize what that means to ourselves. And that means teaching our children, above all, what the Israeli young know, which is that you have to know what you are and love what you are in order for what you are to continue. And we have to teach our Jewish children that, which I think we haven't taught them enough. But if we teach them that, then we will come through this.
Melanie, I think this is a perfectly appropriate way to end this part of the program. Hanukkah connects to the Hebrew word chinuch, education, and how fitting that you spoke to us as we enter the holiday. With your clarity and insight, you not only educate, you give courage to audiences around the world, including this one. Thank you for this enlightening and emboldening conversation. I think we might have time for one or two questions from the audience, but before we do, I'd like to just thank UJA for having the wisdom to invite Melanie Phillips. And yes. And I want to single out Adrian Rubin Price and Elizabeth Newman Corey for making the program happen. You're all welcome to take a copy of the book, and there's conversation and refreshments outside. Do we have time for one or two questions? Okay, I'm going to let Adrian. Whoever, Adrian has a mic.
Hi. I hope I can articulate this correctly, because you were speaking about how so many young Jewish kids don't identify with Israel, don't stand for Israel, don't care about Israel. That's the problem. Have you ever tried to talk to them? It is like talking to the man on the moon. They are so indoctrinated. They so don't care. They don't like us. They don't want to be like us. I don't know how to combat that. I don't know how to turn these kids around. How do you do it?
I don't know either. But it's like, you know, you're dealing with a cult, and you have to find ways of deprogramming from the cult. I mean, there are two issues here. One is the kids who are like that already, and the other is the desperate need to stop more of becoming like that. And I do think, and I'm speaking, you know, mainly from the experience of Britain, but I think it's also true of America as well, that there is something very wrong with the education in our Jewish schools, because they're not coming. These kids, even with kids in Jewish schools, are coming out with the wrong values. That is to say, they may be taught everything there is to know about Daf Yomi and Gemara, and how to live a Jewish life in terms of observance. They may be the last word in all of that. But they're not taught Jewish ethics. They're not taught Jewish history. They're not taught recent Jewish history. And they're not taught how to be proud of those principles. They're not taught about how those principles infuse everything that they've taken for granted. And they're not taught, basically, moral responsibility. I mean, these are, you know, these are attitudes which come out of a sense of entitlement. Judaism isn't about entitlement, it's about duty. That's a terrible word, isn't it? Duty. I mean, everybody goes, oh, you know, you're so forbidding, you're so severe. Without duty and responsibility, the things that they all take for granted, compassion, go smash. That's what they have to be told. And I don't know how you do that. There are people who do know how to do that. There are gifted educators in a kind of psychological way. But they have to be enlisted, because this is a kind of, you know, a sort of cultural, people-wide emergency that you have here. So the answer is I don't know, but I think that's, you know, it has to be addressed. But also the future children have to be addressed in the sense of, you know, what are we teaching them? What are we not teaching them that we should be teaching them?